Olá, boa tarde a todos, boa tarde a todas. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos ao nosso quarto seminário do Grupo de Pesquisa Vertentes do Fantástico na Literatura, Diversos, Fantásticos, que nós iniciamos hoje. Gostaria de dar as boas-vindas, então, oficialmente, como líder do grupo de pesquisa, a todos e a cada um e a cada uma de vocês. Espero que estejam todos bem. Hoje nós vamos iniciar com a nossa palestra de abertura, que nós vamos ter, então, o professor Toby Widdicombe, da Universidade do Alasca, que vai nos trazer uma conferência de abertura sobre o texto On Fairy Stories, sobre histórias de fadas, do nosso querido J.R.R. Tolkien, né? Esse é um texto teórico, né? Esse é um texto em que Tolkien expressa as suas concepções sobre fantasia, sobre fantástico. Então, eu fiz questão de trazer um especialista em Tolkien para tratar deste texto e nos brindar com uma conferência de abertura. Bom, eu vou, então, colocar o professor Toby e a apresentação dele aqui em tela. Vou fazer a apresentação oficial dele em português e em inglês, e então passar a palavra para ele. Bem, o professor Toby Widdicombe é o professor titular de inglês da University of Alaska, at Anchorage, em Anchorage. Ele é um especialista e um pesquisador em Tolkien, em Shakespeare, em literatura norte-americana, em estudos de textos, em cinema e utopia. E ele publicou já vários livros sobre Tolkien, sobre Edward Bellamy, sobre Shakespeare, sobre Raymond Chandler e sobre escritas de viagem anglo-americanas. Também publicou muitos artigos em diversas revistas acadêmicas. Seus interesses de pesquisa incluem, dentre diversos outros, a obra de Tolkien, as obras de Shakespeare, utopia, teoria crítica, poesia e literatura norte-americana. Então, agora também vou pedir aqui a licença de vocês para fazer a apresentação do professor Toby em inglês e passar, então, a palavra para ele. So, Professor Toby Widdicombe is Professor of English at the University of Alaska at Anchorage. He is a scholar in J.R.R. Tolkien, Shakespeare, American literature, textual studies, film, and utopianism, and has published books on Tolkien, Edward Bellamy, Shakespeare, Raymond Chandler, and Anglo-American travel writing, as well as articles in many academic journals. His research interests include, among others, the works of Tolkien, the works of Shakespeare, utopianism, theory, poetry, and American literature. And with that introduction, I thank you, Toby, for having you here with us. So the word is yours. As I told you, the pulpit is yours.
Thank you so much, Cito. I'd like to start out by thanking you for inviting me to make this keynote presentation, because Tolkien really matters to me. I am one of the few people in Alaska, if not in the United States, who actually met Tolkien. And I was, of course, a very young boy then, and Tolkien was a very old man, but I still remember him, and I still remember the profound influence that The Lord of the Rings in particular had on me. And so it is delightful to talk about him, to have an opportunity to talk about him again. And in particular, in relation, obviously, to this question of fantasy and his depiction of fairy. And later on in the presentation, I'm going to get on to why it's perilous. But I want to start out by just giving you a sense of where we're going in the next, 50 minutes, an hour. And I'm going to begin with a little bit about Tolkien before he ever wrote on fairy stories. And that's basically 1893 to 1938, since the first version of On Fairy Stories is 1939. Then I'm going to get on to On Fairy Stories and talk about how it's structured, what its major ideas are, perhaps also a little bit about what its peculiarities are as a piece of rhetoric, because he does some interesting things in this essay that are in some ways quite old-fashioned, I think. Then I'm going to get on to a kind of explanation of his theories of fantasy, his theories of fairy, in relation to one of his three stories that can legitimately be said to be fairy stories in the traditional sense of that phrase. And I'm going to get on to this idea of why fairies or elves are perilous, why they're dangerous. Peril is a lovely word, and danger is a better term, perhaps just because peril is not a word that is used much in contemporary English in any event. So that's the fourth piece. And then I'm going to get on to contextualize Tolkien a little bit in terms of theories of the fantastic. And I'm going to look at six of the useful theories of the fantastic. I'm also maybe going to point out that I don't find any of the theories entirely adequate. And I think that there really is there's significant room on the part of an intellectual and academic to write a better theory of fantasy than there is out there. And then to set up discussion, I'm going to point out 8 questions that are important to me when I think about fantasy. And I hope get the discussion going after the presentation itself. And then, because I'm a poet, and I wanted to finish with an example of subcreation. And subcreation is a very important theory that Tolkien has in his work. I'm actually going to offer you a poem that I wrote that is called an acrostic. And an acrostic is a poem where the initial letters of each line spell something out. It's a very particular kind of poem. I'm going to finish with that, and then obviously we'll move on to discussion. So without more ado, let me see. I want to talk a little bit about Tolkien before he writes on fairy stories. And this first quotation is, I think, really interesting. And this is from his mother. And I'll actually go ahead just a little bit. So this is actually a quote from this letter. This is a facsimile of the letter. That's it. This is a facsimile of the letter between those 2 yellow marks. And the line is this, that Tolkien's mother writes to her in-laws, her father-in-law, mother-in-law, in 1893. So Tolkien is 1 year old at this point, just about. And she says this: "Baby Ronald does look such a fairy when he's very much dressed up in white frills and white shoes. I wish you could all see him, even when he's very much undressed. I think he looks more of an elf still." And this is an indication of how children were dressed then. Even male children were dressed in a very frilly kind of way. And it's also interesting from that quote that she is eliding, or she is saying that the word fairy and elf are, in her mind, essentially the same thing. And I just point that out. In 1897, so at this point, Tolkien, as a child, is back in England, and he attends the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And there are fairy lights. Then, at about the age of 8, 1900, he actually begins to enjoy fairy stories. And the interesting point here is he dislikes Hans Christian Andersen. And we might perhaps in discussion get onto questions about why he should have disliked Hans Christian Andersen at such an early age, and frankly continued to dislike Hans Christian Andersen, because Hans Christian Andersen is worldwide considered a very important writer of fairy tales. So then he writes his first fairy poem, Wood Sunshine, in 1910. At that point, he is 18. Yes, 18. It's the first in a long succession. And let me point out, by just going ahead a moment, how many there are. So this is a selection, right? It's not the entire list. It's a selection of poems by Tolkien that were written on the subject of fairy between 1912 and 1919. It looks like it's over a dozen. The Sea Song of an Elder Day, Goblin Feet, Core in a City Lost and Dead, The Shores of Fairy, The Princess Nigh, The Trumpets of Fairy, Tin Fang Warble, Cotillion Among the Trees, and so on. I actually want to read one of them out to you. And the one that's marked with a red mark is the one I'm going to read out, and it's called The Lonely Isle. This is from a collection, a very obscure collection, actually, that was published. It's called Leeds University Verse. He was at Leeds University at the time as a professor. Leeds University Verse, 1914 to 1924. And he had a couple of poems published in this, as I say, pretty obscure collection. I want to preface it by pointing out that I don't think that Tolkien was a very good poet. He wrote very good songs. They're great songs in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I don't think his poetry is very effective. It's quite derivative, and it's important for what it says, not for how it says it. But I want you to see the extent to which we need to think about Tolkien and the fantastic, and Tolkien and fairy, not just in terms of traditional narratives, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and all of the many stories by him that have been published since his death in 1973. You also need to be thinking about him as a poet, because he wrote poetry throughout his life, and it is adequate enough, good enough, obviously, to have been published. So here's my reading of this poem that has a mark next to it in red, called The Lonely Isle. O glimmering island set sea-girdled and alone, a gleam of white rock through a sunny haze, O all ye hoary caverns ringing with the moan of long green waters in the southern bays, ye murmurous never-ceasing voices of the tide, ye plumed foams wherein the shoreland spirits ride, ye white birds flying from the whispering coast and wailing conclaves of the silver shore, sea voiced, sea winged, lamentable host who cry about unharbored beaches evermore, who sadly whistling skim these waters grey and wheel about my lonely outward way. For me forever thy forbidden marge appears, a gleam of white rock over sundering seas, and thou art crowned in glory through a mist of tears, thy shores all full of music and thy lands of ease, old haunts of many children robed in flowers, until the sun paced down his arch of hours, when in the silence fairies with a wistful heart dance to soft airs their harps and viols weave. Down the great wastes and in a gloom apart, I long for thee and thy fair citadel, where echoing through the lighted elms at eve, in a high inland tower there peals a bell. O lonely, sparkling isle, farewell. A couple of things about that poem. One is that you can see some of the imagery that we get in the Second Age in Numenor, and the First Age as well, for that matter, showing up in this idea of the tower on this lonely isle. You also do get this reference to fairies who are depicted almost in the kind of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle George MacDonald way of being small and somewhat transparent, not the kind of dangerous, powerful, immortal creatures that he later created. So what I'm saying here is he started out early in his career somewhat seeing fairies and fairyland in a rather Victorian way. And then later on, after about 1915 or so, he starts to develop a much more vigorous version of what elves can be seen to be. So let me go back in the slides just a little bit. Okay, so we got to that fairy poem, Wood Sunshine, being his first fairy poem, and then I read out The Lonely Isle, which is one that he wrote a couple of years after that. And in 1914, he begins his, what he calls a nonsense fairy language, Quenya, which is his most important Elvish language after Sindarin, I would say. And then we have this comment from 1933, which is him kind of looking back a little bit on his early development of Elvish ideas. And he says this, quote, "In what we meant by romance, there must be at least the hint of another world. One must hear the horns of Elfland." 1933. What he seems to be saying, actually, if you unpack it, is that any kind of romance needs to have a quality of fantasy or fairy in it to be successful. And then you can't quite see what that the bottom of the last slide, this slide says, but basically I point out that not only was he interested in his career in developing fairy in a narrative sense and fantasy in a narrative sense in his many works, but also he was professionally engaged in it, in that he was, as a professor at Oxford University, he had the responsibility of superintending students who produced what are called B-Lit theses, and B-Lit just means it's a particular kind of advanced degree. And those students that in particular he supervised wrote theses on George MacDonald and on Andrew Lang, both of whom are extremely important in the history of fairy tales, as I'm sure many of you know. So that's enough, I think, for that. Let me move on to a different element again. So we've talked about poetry a bit. We've talked about narrative a bit. I've shown you a little bit about how early fairy matters to him. And he's producing poetry, and actually he's starting his legendarium as early as about 22, there or thereabouts. The other aspect you need to think about when you think about fairy with Tolkien, perhaps you need to think about in general with the depiction of fantasy, is you need to think about it in art, in terms of art. And the next few slides are just going to be his drawings, his paintings of how he envisaged the world of fairy that he created. It's a slight exaggeration to say that fantasy didn't begin before Tolkien. It's only a slight exaggeration. Tolkien is the most important figure in fantasy in the 20th century. And I think that's pretty much irrefutable. So it's a little difficult, I know, on the slide perhaps to read what the captions are saying. So I'll go ahead and just tell you what the captions are. So this is from 1915, and this is his image of what he calls the shores of fairy. Very interesting color scheme. This is from 1915, and it's what he called Tanaki at that time. And it later became Tanikatil, and it became that famous tower that was crucial to a geographical understanding of the Valar. Again, the same color scheme, I would say. This is another image of, this is called Mithrim, and this is a geographical image of a place in Elfland or in Middle-earth. And the border is his too. The black and white border above and below is his. This is a particular event that happens in the Children of Hurin. And this is the dragon. And the dragon is setting out to pursue and to try to kill Turin. One of the, I would say, most famous events in the First Age, because of course the dragon is not successful. Glorund is not successful. He actually dies at the sword of Turin. These are the halls of Manwë. Manwë being one of the most important of the Valar, as I'm sure many of you know. What I think at this point I need to sort of editorialize and say is that I think he's a very good artist. I think he has huge talent as an artist. And I think he's actually a better artist than he is a poet. And then he's a much greater writer than he is an artist. It's that kind of categorization, that kind of hierarchy I'm suggesting. So that's the Halls of Manwë, 1928. This is 1928. This is Fangorn Forest. So this is that very important geographical area in The Lord of the Rings. And obviously it echoes, suggests Treebeard. And Treebeard is one of those wonderful Entish figures that is so delightful in the narrative of Lord of the Rings. That's 1928. And this is the Vale of Sirion. He did a lot of colored art. He did a lot of black and white art as well. And you can see now, this is 15 years after, I think, the first illustration that I gave you. So he is doing art consistently during this period. And I think, like many great writers, he is using another medium to, as a catalyst to create in as impressive a way as possible. This is Nargothrond, one of the famous hidden kingdoms of the First Age, one of the three elvish hidden kingdoms. And it looks a lot like Rivendell. He seems to have liked a particular kind of image, and the image is of chasms and running water and beautiful buildings perched above natural features. This is Gondolin. So this is another of the hidden kingdoms, so from September 1928. This is Nargothrond again. And this is the last one I'll come to. This is a doodle. And I don't know if any of you actually know what the English word doodle means. Doodle is a rough sketch that somebody does when he is not really concentrating. And this is, I doodle a lot for whatever reason. So I understand the desire to doodle. I have never doodled like this. This is extraordinary. And this apparently is the kind of doodle that Tolkien did fairly regularly during his entire career. Let's move on fairy stories. So this essay exists in 3 different versions. And the different versions aren't terribly important in terms of their differences. But I do want to make you aware of the fact that it starts out as a lecture. So it's quite oral in the way that it is constructed. And that orality never goes away. But it's published in book form in 1947. And then it's reprinted in 1964. And it was reprinted in order to make a big enough book to publish some other work by Tolkien. So it was an important essay, but it was there, as I say, to make a big enough book. It was never thought of in 1964 as being published by itself, because Tolkien was really famous by 1964, but even Tolkien would not have been profitable with just an essay published in itself, because the audience would not have, the audience would not have bought it, I think. Literally would not have bought it. Okay. The other thing I'll say about on fairy stories, which struck me the other day when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, is that what is remarkable is that Tolkien says nothing, or next to nothing, about other theories of fantasy. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is that there was not a great deal of theory out there about fantasy before Tolkien. There was some, but there was not a great deal. That's one thing to consider as far as the absence of theory is concerned. The other thing to remember is that, and I'm from England and I grew up in England, although I teach in the United States, so I'm very familiar with English culture and I'm very familiar with English education. And I will say that when it comes to theory, the theory that was dominant at this time in England, in other words, the 1930s, even as late as 1964, was something called new criticism. And what new criticism says is you look at the work itself. That's all you do. You don't develop complicated theories about it. You don't use other theorists as a way in to understanding literary work. I have a lot of respect for that myself because I was brought up in that tradition. But you need to see that's where Tolkien is coming from. He tries to answer three really useful questions. One is, what are fairy stories? Right? In a sense, how do you define them? Second thing is, where do they come from? How far back do they go? And once he settled those two questions, the third one is, okay, what are their value? And I think you'll see that the really useful pieces in this essay are not actually what a fairy story is a definition, not even necessarily the origins. What's really interesting is how fairy stories can be used. And by that, I mean how readers can interact with them. Okay, so he begins his definition of fairy stories by looking at the Oxford English Dictionary, the greatest dictionary in the world. And I say that as an Englishman, but I think it probably is the greatest dictionary in the world of one country's language. It's very, very highly regarded. Tolkien, you may not remember this or you may not know this, actually worked on the Oxford English Dictionary shortly after the First World War. So between about 1918 or 19 and about 1922, he worked for the Oxford English Dictionary. And so he has a lot of affection for it. So of course, when he writes this essay, he goes, oh, I'm going to go to the Oxford English Dictionary to get the definition. Having done that, he then says, the traditional view of fairies is wrong. And he looks at three people in particular, Doyle, that is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, Michael Drayton, who was a Renaissance dramatist, and then Shakespeare. He did not have much respect, much love for Shakespeare. Tolkien did not. And he says, you know, elves, fairies are not this diaphanous tiny creature that just hangs around making life difficult for human beings in a very minor way. He's going to come up, he has already come up, obviously, in The Hobbit and in his Legendarium in general, with another idea of what actually elves are all about. So then he presents his own definition. And his own definition is founded on 3 Ds and a T: desire, difference, dream, truth. Okay. Desire is a really important concept. For him, the driving force behind fantasy is the desire to be completely fulfilled as a human being. And one of the ways that you do that is you live an other different life. And that other different life is that of a completely different species, in a sense, in a different dimension, and that is fairies, elves. Okay. Difference. Difference is the fundamental driver of desire. We see ourselves as different from elves. We see ourselves in some ways as better than elves, but in many ways in the
Hello, Toby.
I
I think you went down a little bit.
did.
Perhaps in
Yeah,
the
sorry about
internet.
that.
It's okay. It's okay, okay?
Let me go to slides again.
All right.
And I'm seeing it as there. I think it. Okay, cool. I'm sorry about that, everybody, but you know, the internet is in its infancy. So let me get to where I was. I'll quickly go through these slides. I think I got that far, yes. Okay, good. So I was on, I think, Dream. Dream is vital in understanding fantasy for Tolkien. And it's vital because he himself, as a human being, had a great many important dreams that he apparently wrote down in his diaries, which we haven't had published, but which actually exist. And it's also, I think, important to him because he is an anti-Freudian. He did not believe in Freud. He actually despised Freud, but he thought dream was important. So he's thinking dream is important to fantasy. Dream is not important in Freudian terms to understanding how crummy, how bad your childhood was, that kind of thing. And then truth. The really important thing to understand about Tolkien is that he believes in fantasy as a route, as a means of getting to truth. There is the truth of the world in which we live, our five senses, that does exist. It's very important. It is less important from his point of view than the truth of the spirit and the truth that is beyond the senses. And that's what he was trying to accomplish in his Legendarium, is creating a world that is outside us, our mundane, everyday senses, but which is vibrant in ways that his millions of followers, millions of readers agree with. Interestingly, he says that some fairy stories that are traditionally thought of as fairy stories are not. And there's a collection by Andrew Lang of 12-volume collection. And he says, you know, this is Tolkien says, fairy stories are not traveler's tales. Fairy stories are not beast fables. So he's narrowing down the definition of fairy stories. I don't want you to think that the definition is all inclusive for Tolkien, because it really isn't. So what are the origins? This has come a little, it's not coming correct in terms of formatting on the screen, but all the materials there. So the first thing to think about, and this is wonderful for all of us who love fairy tales, who love fairy stories, is that it's universal. Fairy stories are universal. The love for them is universal, and they are, for him, from his point of view, underpinning so much of world literature. Language, invention, inheritance, diffusion. Human love of language. We all love to play with language. We all love to invent. We all have an inheritance linguistically, ideationally, emotionally from those who brought us up, our parents or whoever it was responsible for bringing you up. You get that inheritance from them, and then you diffuse it. And actually, you know, to some degree, what's going on today, I don't want to make it too important an event, but what's going on today is diffusion, right? I am diffusing my sense to you of what fairy stories are about from Tolkien's point of view. Subcreation for many of you, I know you know this term. Tolkien did not feel that he could create. He didn't feel he could create in fairy stories because he was a strong believer in Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. And he had no right, therefore, to pretend to be God and create. All that he could do is to subcreate. As a human being, create a world, the world of Middle-earth, in respect and honor to God, to the Catholic God. And then there are three faces of fairy, three faces of fantasy. They're not quite the same thing, I think, but they're nearly the same. There's the mystical, the magical, and the mirroring. And I think the interesting one there is actually mirroring, scorn and pity towards humanity. If you think about what happens in The Lord of the Rings, you think about what happens in The Hobbit, there is scorn there. You can think about scorn in a character in Lord of the Rings like Denethor, for example. But there's a great deal of pity. And actually, pity from his point of view was a supreme value that could be demonstrated through fantasy or through fairy. And you can see that because it is pity that leads Frodo to spare Gollum. And if he had not spared Gollum, he could have killed him on a couple of occasions. The elves could have killed him. Had he not been spared, the end of the Lord of the Rings would have been a very different thing. So pity is a very important concept for him in fairy tales, fairy stories. So what are their uses? Okay. He says they're not just for children. And I think he's right there. I mean, I'm not quarreling with him, but I'm going to say that he actually thinks that fairy stories are best understood by adults, by us, right? He says that their uses are that they suspend your disbelief. Human beings, from Tolkien's point of view, perhaps I think also from my point of view, are somewhat skeptical. We dislike a lot of things, we judge, we doubt. He says that one of the values of fairy stories is it makes us believe again. Actually, it makes us, frankly, be childlike again. Not childish, but childlike again. And then he says, got 4 particular uses, and these are very much Tolkien's quote-unquote invention, especially the last of them. Okay. The value of fairy stories is that they are fantastic. They create a secondary world. They enchant us. And his view is that one of the fundamental drivers, the values of literature, is that it allows us to escape. The second thing is recovery. I think, and this is speculation on my part, but I think that one of the values of fairy stories from Tolkien's point of view was that it allowed him to escape a lifelong depression from which he suffered. And I won't go into why he would have been a sufferer from depression beyond, his incredibly difficult, incredibly poor childhood, his being an orphan, his having suffered through the First World War. That's enough, I think, to make anybody depressed for life. But the idea is that fairy story allows you to recover. It renews you. It allows you to as a reader, achieve equilibrium again, a balance of the mind again. It allows you to escape. That's the third idea. And here he says it allows you to escape from hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, and death. Let me suggest there's another set of words that are actually more famous than that list of how awful life is. And they appear in Thomas Hobbes' famous political treatise called Leviathan. And Leviathan was written, oh gosh, it would have been the early 17th century. According to Thomas Hobbes, we as human beings, our life is, the life we lead is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, short. That sounds a lot like hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. Fantasy allows us to escape it. Fairy tales allows us to escape the awfulness of everyday life, even for those who are well off, even for those who are healthy. The final thing is the most important, I think. Through fairy tales, we are consoled about life. Catastrophe happens. We achieve joy where there's a return of grace. That is very much the narrative arc of the Legendarium. It's very much, when we look at it in Smith of Wootton Major, actually, the arc of that story, and we'll get to that fairy tale in a moment. I should explain the word eucatastrophe because it's what we call in English, and I'll put this in chat, it's a nonce word. I hope it's there. Yeah, it is there. Good. The nonce word, it means he invented it. It's also called a neologism. but that's a higher sounding word. Nonce word's a good term for it. So eucatastrophe means catastrophe. We know it's probably even the same in Portuguese or something like it in Portuguese. It wouldn't surprise me. It means something terrible happening, right? But you on the front means good. So good things can happen. And in fairy tales, that is the narrative arc according to Tolkien. Okay, let me come to this one. Here we go. Okay. Let me see where we are. Yes. Okay. Good. So I just thought you might like some quotes from on fairy stories, so you can see what it is that he says, not just my summary of it, but actually his very words. So, fairy is a perilous land. There's the word perilous, right? And in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. So if you're a theorist, you better be careful with fantasy and get it right. And he says that right at the beginning of the essay. So it's like he's saying, as an essayist, I do hope my ideas are right. Quote, that long line of flower fairies and fluttering sprites with antennae that I so disliked as a child. So there we have the dislike of the typical Victorian Arthur Conan Doyle fairy. That is absolutely not the fairies that we have in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The First Age of Middle-earth, and so on. The fates of men and elves are sundered and our paths seldom meet. Notice he's saying that elves actually exist. And at some level, emotionally, he did think they existed. They were not his invention. He was simply representing that which is out there that he was aware of. He then says, a real taste for fairy stories was awakened in me by philology, that's linguistics, on the threshold of manhood and quickened to full life by war. That's a very important point. Fairy tales for him, the importance of them comes from the fact that they were something which allowed him joy, eucatastrophe, in the midst of the First World War, the most appalling conflict in human history, worse even, I think, in some ways than the Second World War. Tolkien fought at the Battle of the Somme, and the Battle of the Somme was the worst British military casualties in its entire long, storied military history. It was an appalling battle. Fantasy remains a human right. I've got to say, I love that. I think about human rights, and they're very important to me, and I think, I wouldn't have thought of fantasy as a human right, but my God, I think it is. And Tolkien is very convincing about how it is. Consolation is a sudden and miraculous grace never to be counted on to recur. So you can't always assume that things are going to end well. You have to make them. You have to strive to make them end well. Okay, so that's the key quotations. At this point, does anybody have any questions? I'm probably about halfway through, maybe a little bit more than halfway through. And I don't want you to feel like you just have to listen to me for a while longer if you have questions that are important to you. So you can put them in chat, or you can, or Cito can let me know.
Yes, Toby. Yes, we already have one question for you. Okay. I will translate the question. Okay, it's João Vitor's question. Okay, about the poems. The poems you mentioned in the beginning of your talk. João Vitor asks if those poems were written while Tolkien was participating in the First World War. And actually, he makes two questions. This is the first one. The second one is, from these poems, okay, what was adapted, what was reused in the Middle-earth universe, what was used by Tolkien, or actually put inside the universe. So the first question, okay, is if the poems were written during Tolkien's participation during the First World War. Let's start with that.
Okay. That's a really interesting question. I very much appreciate it. So the answer, this is a good academic answer. The answer is yes and no. The answer, yes, is absolutely. It was written during the period between 1914 and 1918. So that's the beginning of the First World War, the end of the First World War. But Tolkien is on record as saying he couldn't write in the trenches. He couldn't write as a soldier waiting to fight because it was too gritty, it was too grimy, it was too dirty, it was too noisy. So actually, this material tended to be written after about November 1916 and the end of the First World War, which is November 1918, because you may not know this, but actually Tolkien only served as a soldier between about June 1916 and November 1916, because he fought in that Somme battle, but then he caught something called trench fever. And trench fever you got from, I believe, you got it from lice. It was a contamination from lice, body lice. And it would cause you to get a fever, and it would cause you to be unable to fight. So he was actually hospitalized. He was invalided out, and he never went back to fight. He was an invalid between the end of 1916 and the end of 1918 when the war ended. And he spent his time in hospitals in England. And so that was when he was able to write, because he wasn't deathly sick, but he couldn't fight. He wasn't able to fight. He wasn't physically able to fight, but he was certainly able to sit in his bed and write and read and paint and sketch. I hope that's a decent answer. So, Cedar, what is the second?
The second question is from the poems. What was reused? What was adapted by Tolkien into the creation of Middle-earth?
Yes. Before I answer that, Cedar, would you mind actually just reading out those questions in Portuguese, because I want to listen to Portuguese.
Okay, for sure. First question was: esses poemas de Tolkien foram escritos durante a sua participação na Primeira Guerra Mundial? And the second question: o que foi reaproveitado ou adaptado para o universo da Terra-média? Terra-média is the translation of Middle-earth into Portuguese.
That's lovely, thank you.
You're welcome.
The answer is, this is an easy answer. The answer is everything. Everything that he wrote early, he starts writing his Legendarium as early as about 1914. So he's only in his early 20s at that point. And everything gets funneled into his creation. He keeps on using and reusing material. And it goes in two different directions, actually, when he starts to use it in the Silmarillion, in The Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit. It goes in the same two directions. One is to write less. I'll put this in chat just because it's an unusual word.
Toby,
yeah.
People cannot see the chat.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay,
but I can tell them mawkish.
Mawkish.
Mm-hmm.
Mawkish. Mawkish means overly sentimental. So his early work is overly sentimental. When he reuses it for The Hobbit, when he reuses it for The Lord of the Rings, he creates better poems. He's a better poet later on in his life than he was when he was younger. That is, I think, because poetry as a form of art changed in England during his lifetime. The other direction it takes his poetry is he writes songs. And if you think about The Hobbit, there's so many songs in The Hobbit. When you think about The Lord of the Rings, there's songs in The Lord of the Rings. There's even some actually in the Silmarillion, but not as many. So what he was doing is a well-known literary challenge or device, and that is cannibalism. he was taking his own material and reusing it. Okay, shall I move on?
Oh, we have here more questions, Toby.
Good.
It seems people loved, okay, the let me it seems people loved all that you said. Okay, let me take João Vitor's comment out. Actually, we have more 3 questions. I don't know if you want to answer those now, or if you prefer to leave them to the end. What do you?
Shall I leave them to the end, just so that the side of my argument doesn't get lost? Is that okay?
Okay, perfect. Okay,
Yeah,
they are right here, just prepared for you to answer.
Okay, perfect. So let's move on to the particular fairy story that I'm using to illustrate what Tolkien says earlier about this is how I define the fairy story. This, I think, is one of the most important works by Tolkien, and it is one that almost nobody ever reads. It's one that almost nobody ever writes about. It is a fascinating fairy tale. But it's one of only 3 that he wrote that are formal fairy tales. There's fairy elements in The Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, The Hobbit, the whole legendarium. But he only actually ever wrote 3 clearly fairy tale stories. Farmer Giles of Ham was one of them, late 1920s, published in 1949. Leaf by Niggle, which if you haven't read, I strongly encourage you to, because it's a fascinating story about Tolkien's anxieties as a writer. And then 1967, Smith of Wootton Major. So it is the last story he wrote in his lifetime. He died 6 years later. It's a very late work by Tolkien. Dates to 1964, and I'll explain what happens. He has been asked to write by the publisher a preface to a very well-known fairy story from the 19th century, George MacDonald's The Golden Key. And he starts writing this preface. And he gets 5 or 6 pages in, and then he decides he's going to write a bit of a fairy story to explain what his preface means. And he never goes back to the preface. He just writes the fairy story. So I will say about Tolkien, there's this really interesting struggle between being a creative writer, writing Smith of Wootton Major, and being an academic and writing a preface to another person's book. And in the case of Smith and Wootton Major, as so often happened with Tolkien, the creative writer wins out. Tolkien was a great academic. He wrote important academic works. Nobody reads them these days in comparison to the millions who read The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings. He was a greater creative writer even than he was an academic. Okay. Let me move to the next slide. Okay. I just thought it would be interesting for you to see some illustrations that a company went with the story, Smith of Wootton Major. These are not by Tolkien. The earlier illustrations I showed you were by Tolkien. These are by Pauline Baynes. And Pauline Baynes is the most important illustrator in Tolkien history, as it were, Tolkien studies, because she did the illustrations for a number of his books and is very highly regarded. So she did these for Smith of Wootton Major, and I'm just going to quickly go through them. And again, these are by Pauline Baynes. They are not by Tolkien. These, I think, are scenes from the book itself. Sometimes I can't quite match the illustration to the text, but I think they're supposed to be. They're black and white art in the original book, as well as in this, which is from the paperback version of it. Okay, I'll back up. Yeah, that's the last one. Let me just suggest something to you, which I think is interesting. When you read Smith and Wootton Major, if you have the illustrated version of it, you have Pauline Bain's wonderful illustrations, and they are an example of what is called paratext. And paratext is the word text with P-A-R-A in front of it, paratext. And paratext is everything in a book that is not the words themselves. And what I'm saying here is, as a reader, you need to think about what is the value to you of, in a fairy tale, paratext illustrations. Does it enrich the experience? Does it conflict? Is the illustrator just another reader? And so on. So I'll just throw that one out there as an idea and move on. I'm just going to give you a moment to actually read this, because I don't want to assume that all of you have read Smith and Wootton Major. So this is a summary, and I'll, as I say, just let you read it for a few minutes, and then I'll move on. I hope that's given you enough time to get a sense of what the story's about. I'll just say one thing before I look at the story in a little detail. I think Smith is a deliberate choice on his part. Smith is an important name in his stories, in this story, for two reasons. One is Smith is the commonest name in English, period. So Smith is everyone. We are all Smith, is what he's saying. But also, in the First World War, he had 3 childhood friends. 2 of them died, only 1 of them survived the First World War. And one of the people who died was a man called Geoffrey H. Smith. And so I think it's both personal, Smith, to this friend he had who died in the First World War, and it's Smith as every man. Okay. I'll quickly go through this because I want to make sure we get to the theory part of it. It's a loose allegory. And Tolkien is on record saying he didn't like allegories, but I think this is clearly an allegory. And I explain in that item, in that paragraph, what it's an allegory of. It is a story about the power of fairy in everyday life, because the truth is not the truth of the senses. The truth that matters is the truth of the imagination. Think about all the ways in which your imagination creates things that never existed. Those are actually the things that matter. The other interesting thing about it is it's a cautionary tale about the difficult balance between academic life and creative writing. This is all about Tolkien saying, I can't be great at both. And his academic life suffered as a result of his creative writing. He was a very important professor. He did not produce enough academic work. His colleagues were always complaining about that. The other piece of it is, this is Tolkien realizing he's aging. He's 6 years from death, as it happened, but he knows that he's old. He's retired from academic life, and it worries him that he's getting old, and what's going to happen to his talent as a result of getting old. When he dies, who is going to take over? Okay. I'm going, I think, to give you a chance just to read those, and then I'm going to comment on maybe 1 or 2 of them, because I don't want to take up too much time. Let me draw your attention to two of those quotes. The one in the middle: better a little doll, maybe, than no memory of fairy at all. For some, the only glimpse; for some, the awaking. What he means by that is anything that you can do to appreciate fantasy. It doesn't matter if it's just a little plastic fairy. That matters. For some people, that's all you ever see of the world of fairy. For other people, it's an awakening. It's when you are aware of the existence of fairyland and the ability human beings have to make a virtue out of fantasy. The last line I think is important. Smith to his son: I shall not be going on journeys again, Ned, not on long ones, if you understand me. This, I think, is Tolkien speaking to his son Christopher, who was responsible after his father's death for all the publication of his father's work, the many books by his father that he published after his death, including the Silmarillion. And it's Tolkien saying to his son, I'm not going to write anything important anymore. I'm not going to finish the Silmarillion. You're going to have to do it, Christopher, or in the story, Ned. These are quotations about Smith of Wootton Major, and the most interesting one is the third one. It's by a scholar in Tolkien studies, Paul Kocher. And he says, quote, Tolkien broke his wand and drowned his magic books. That is a direct reference to Shakespeare's The Tempest, in which the central character Prospero breaks his wand and ceases to be a magician. This story is about Tolkien saying, this is the end of my career. And he finishes it on a high note, because I think when you read Smith of Wootton Major, you will see how brilliant a story it is. It's so delightfully complicated, even though it superficially is an easy narrative. Okay. So where is the peril? Just quickly, and then I want to get on to questions and theories. The most important quotation is this conversation between Boromir and Aragorn, two of my favorite characters, especially, of course, Aragorn. Boromir says, Lothlorien, that wonderful country ruled by Galadriel and Celeborn. It's a perilous land. Few come out who once go in, and of that few, none have escaped unscathed. You've got to be careful with fairy. If you get seriously into fantasy, you will be a different person. That's what Tolkien is saying. And Aragorn says something really important. Perilous indeed, fair and perilous, but only evil need fear it, or those who bring some evil with them. So this is Tolkien saying, I actually don't have to really worry that much about fairy unless you're using fantasy in an evil, wicked, mean way. And that's a description really of Lothlorien. The people who are good of heart, they survive, they get better, they improve, and the orcs and so on simply are killed because they are evil, or they are a product of evil. Sauron's evil. Okay. I'm going to move on from this, I think, because I do want to get to the theory part of things. I'll just give you maybe this third bullet point, this third paragraph. One cannot stay in fairy. When one leaves, one has an overwhelming sense of loss and bereavement. Now, this is my idea. This is not Tolkien saying. This is my sense of what Tolkien is saying. And we've all experienced this. Let's assume that all of you love The Lord of the Rings, let's say, or The Silmarillion, or The Hobbit. You feel bereaved when you have stopped reading it. And it's true that you then go and read it again, but you're still bereaved. You still have this profound sense of loss because you've existed in an extraordinary world, a fantastic world, and now you're back to the mundane world that has its enjoyments, obviously, but it's not the world of fantasy. Publication is perilous. First point about fairy. Tolkien would only have published The Hobbit in his entire lifetime if he had not been lucky enough to have had a publisher prepared to wait almost 20 years for his masterwork, The Lord of the Rings. George Allen and Unwin were an amazingly patient publisher. The Silmarillion, remember, was not published in his lifetime. So he might only have actually been known for The Hobbit, which is a wonderful story, but it's not The Lord of the Rings and it's not the Silmarillion. I've said this before, the second paragraph, the Great War is the most important catalyst for everything about Tolkien's Legendarium. And then the final point is the reason that Tolkien spent a lifetime on his Legendarium, a lifetime in Fairyland, is that he had survivor's guilt after the First World War. His friends die, he wants to memorialize them, and he memorializes them by the creation of great art, thankfully. It's a wonderful thing to have done. Okay. I will just say that there are 6 theories of the fantastic that I think have merit. Zvedan Todorov, obviously, the fantastic, a structural approach to literary genre, 1970, 1973. He introduces the ideas of the uncanny and the marvelous and the pure fantastic. Gerard Genette is more actually about narrative theory, but his important narrative terms, order, frequency, duration, voice, mood, are, I think, useful in understanding any narrative text, and that includes fantasy. The third one, Aliane Becker, she is important in connecting fantasy and science fiction. Zizek, he is anti-fantasy because he says it's actually masking ideology and it's not helping us to cope well in an increasingly abstract world. That's from 2009, The Plague of Fantasies. Just 2 more. Rosemary Jackson, Fantasy, the Literature of Subversion, 2013. She introduces the idea into fantasy of what is its relationship to power and politics. And then finally, Catherine Hume says, you know, fantasy is an element in all literature. So she says we need to valorize, to appreciate fantasy because of its existence in not just Tolkien's world, but in all literature. So here's some questions for you to think about, and we can talk about if we have time. And you can take away as things to think about. The first point I want to make, I actually started with, and that is there is room for a new theory of fantasy. And I encourage any of you who have the energy and years left to do that, because Todorov is in a lot of ways, I think, unsatisfactory, but he's very important. And all the other theorists, I think, that I mentioned have not given us a unified theory of fantasy. And there's a unified theory of fantasy out there that takes into account written texts and multimedia and art in a very general sense. But I don't think it's there yet. So that's the first question. Can there be a unified theory of the fantastic? And if so, what will it look like? Second thing is, how can one get outside fantasy? And by that, I kind of mean when you get into fantasy, how do you get outside it? Because the world in which we live, the everyday world, actually is in its own ways profoundly fantastic. We just ignore the fact that it is as fantastic, as extraordinary as it is. How is fantasy related to desire? How is fantasy related to perception? Do we, in other words, when we perceive the world, deliberately choose for our own comfort to make the world look less fantastic than it actually is? Do we make it look more boring to our eyes because it means we don't have to deal with the complexity of fantasy and its appeal to the imagination? How is fantasy related to psychological fantasy? And this is just to say that I think that there is more of a connection actually between Tolkien and Freud. In particular, Freud is a psychoanalyst than we admit, than Tolkien admitted. The next one is this term is uncanny, is important to Todorov. And I'm wondering to what degree it's related to this Freudian term unheimlich, which means uncanny. And the Freudian uncanny is different from the Todorovian uncanny, but I think they are clearly in some ways related. And that's an interesting question from my perspective. Seventh question, what is the relation between fantasy and ideology? Ideology is that fancy English word for politics with a small p and power with a small p. That is to say, how do we connect fantasy and all the power structures that we experience in our own lives, in our relationships with people, and in our relationships with society? And then finally, and I've sort of talked about this just a little bit earlier, how are text and paratext related in fantasy? That is, the words on the page, how are they related to what somebody illustrates, how somebody illustrates that fantasy that's in words. And I'll give you another example. I talked about Pauline Baines. Let me give you a more recent example. The most recent editions of Tolkien's work, The Fall of Gondolin, Beren and Luthien, Children, Hurin, all have illustrations by Alan Lee, A-L-A-N, last name Lee, L-E-E. A great artist. But they're just in there for the interest of readers. How do they relate to the text, and should we take them seriously? And with that, I think I am done. That's slide 40 out of 40. Oh, the epilogue. Okay. Yeah, I forgot my epilogue. So I'm a poet. Here's my poem about Galadriel. And it's just called Galadriel and an acrostic, and I'll finish with this. As you see, Galadriel in red is down the left-hand margin. Great as only the good are great, and lovely as the dawn after times of suffering, and deep and dark as the woods of my youth, you stared down regret as if it were a paltry thing. I've always wanted to be you, enduring as the fixed stars, lovely as the dusk when the sun dies. So that's my minor piece of sub-creation. With that, I think I am done. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you so much, Toby. So thrilling, this talking. It was amazing. And the questions that you posed on the slide before this last one, they are so provocative. Would you allow me to translate all of them into Portuguese?
Yeah, because then I can
to leave here for the records for sure. And if there will be someone who would like to, discuss them, talk about them with you, there will be, let's say, broader the possibilities.
Great.
Okay, I will translate each one of them, as I said, for the records, and if someone wants to discuss them with you. Então, pessoal, estou dizendo aqui para o professor Toby que eu vou traduzir essas questões para discussão que ele colocou aqui para nós, porque eu acho importante que elas fiquem aqui colocadas e marcadas, porque essas são discussões fundamentais que um grupo como o nosso, um grupo de pesquisa como o nosso, nunca pode perder de vista. E, dada a fala que ele trouxe aqui para nós, essas são questões cruciais. Tá? Então, se alguém quiser conversar, colocar ideias, né, para o professor Toby aqui sobre essas questões, então eu vou traduzi-las para o português, tanto para deixá-las aqui gravadas, quanto para quem quiser conversar com o professor Toby sobre elas, tá? São 8 questões que ele colocou. Pode haver uma teoria única ou unificada do fantástico? É possível uma teoria única e unificada do fantástico? Então, acho que eu gostaria muito que Flávio Garcia e Marisa Gama Calil se pronunciassem sobre essa pergunta, se estiverem aí. How can one get outside fantasy? Pode alguém sair, né, ou estar fora da fantasia? Como a fantasia está relacionada ao desejo? Como a fantasia está relacionada à percepção de mundo? Como a fantasia está relacionada à fantasia psicológica? Aqui uma outra questão bastante teórica. Como o estranho todoroviano está relacionado ao unheimlich freudiano? Nós sabemos que é diferente. O professor Toby deixou muito claro que é diferente e nós sabemos que é diferente, né? Poderia haver uma aproximação entre eles? Qual seria a relação entre fantasia e ideologia? Como os textos e paratextos estão relacionados na fantasia? Então ficam aqui essas questões. Para quem quiser participar, quem quiser responder, quem quiser interagir com o professor Toby, tá bem? So, I'm done, Toby.
Lovely.
Thank you. We have here, okay, many questions for you. Okay.
Good. I'm glad.
We have here something like 6 questions.
Okay.
6 questions. I will, when you get tired of answering questions, you tell me, and then we stop. Okay?
Okay.
We have here 6 questions. 2 of them are very subjective. Brazilian people love to make, let's say, personal questions for scholars. They are very subjective. The other 4 ones, they are very technical, okay? So I will follow the sequence that the questions were made, okay? And you feel absolutely free to answer them or not, okay? It's up to you. First one. This question made by Francisco Melo, okay? It's one of those very subjective questions, okay? How do you understand this multicolored vision of by Tolkien or of Tolkien about his world of fiction? I think that's very, very subjective. I don't know if it's answerable, but anyway, okay. How do you see, okay, this that's very personal, this multicolored vision of Tolkien about his own fictional world?
That's a really interesting question. So obviously from the slides that I showed you, there were 2 kinds of art that are representative of what Tolkien does. One of them is the multicolor and the other is the black and white. And I think the black and white were only ever sketches for being colored. So in other words, if he had had time, he would have colored all of them, but he didn't. He didn't have time, didn't have interest. So multicolor is an essential quality of the world as Tolkien envisaged it. Color is really important. And it's a great question because I hadn't thought of it in these terms, but I think this is absolutely the case. If you think about what happens in the First Age, in the Silmarillion, this is not the Lord of the Rings, this is First Age, the Silmarillion. What is vital to creation is light. And light is necessary to color. And I think about this because I think about how terrible it was that the spider called Ungoliant, who's the great ancestor of Shelob in the Lord of the Rings, Ungoliant steals the light. And it is a crisis in the history of Middle-earth that she does so. And it takes a huge amount of effort on the part of the Valar to recreate light in a way that will be sustaining. So my simple answer to that question is color is vital. And then the subsidiary question is, why might Tolkien use a particular palette, a particular range of colors? That I don't know. That I have to think about.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Toby. Next question. Next question, again, is one of those personal, okay? It was posed by Gilmar Paulista, okay? He's asking to you, what is your favorite passage, okay, in Tolkien's works? Considering that Tolkien and you are scholars and enthusiasts.
Mm-hmm. I have two answers maybe to that. One of them is what in English we call a smart ass answer. And a smart ass answer is a jokey answer. And the jokey answer is everything he ever wrote, almost, right? So my favorite quotation is all of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit, because I hate to not have all of it. But that said, I would say any of the quotations that Gandalf has that deal with the question of how will the Fellowship cope with evil are ones that I will treasure. Can I come up with them from my memory right now? Of course not. But I would say it's any of those. And they really have to do with the sort of fundamental question we have as human beings. Gandalf is all about how do we appear in the world? How do we be heroic? How can we be heroic? How can we do the right thing when it's so much easier to do the wrong thing? And in Tolkien's terms, the wrong thing is, oh, I'm just going to spend the rest of my life in my hobbit hole, and the rest of the world can do what it wants to do. How do you, as a human being, rise to the challenge of defeating evil in your time? And there's any number of questions about that. And I would have to say, Cito and I have talked about this a little bit privately. There seems to be a lot of evil in the world right now. A lot of evil in the world right now. And I am a sophisticated literary critic, but in my heart, I believe in evil. I believe that evil exists. So I hope that's a bit of an answer.
Yeah, I agree with you. And perhaps this answer you gave to this question, perhaps you have something to do to the question I made for you, okay? Among the next one that will come, okay? Okay. So, wonderful. Well, the next one, or the next questions that we have, they are more technical, okay, Toby? They are much closer to your presentation. And we will have here, actually, the next questions, they will be all in English, okay? They were originally made in English by the audience, okay? First one, there will be this one by Rafael Silva Foto. And he put the question into two posts. This is the first part, okay? Can you read there?
Yeah, I can. It's from Raphael. Is that a correct pronunciation, Raphael?
Yes, Raphael. Yes.
Okay. It's a great question. I love it. Because
there is the second part. There is the second part of the question I'll show you.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Let me answer the second part first, because that's Raphael saying, is this what he was trying to do? And I actually think the answer is 100% yes. I think it's crucial to remember that as an academic, Tolkien had two specializations. One of them was Anglo-Saxon and the other was Middle English. So he was an expert in British literature from AD 600 to about AD 1400, from Beowulf to Chaucer. So his poetry needs to be seen in that way. But there's a different tradition too. And the different tradition that I would suggest is called Georgian. Georgian, Georgian, the adjective from George. It's the kind of poetry that was written in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And it's a poetry which is distinguished by rhyme. In the case of Tolkien, he very frequently rhymed in couplets, for example. And it is distinguished by, as I suggested, being overly sentimental. The instance of this that I can recommend to all of you who get interested in this question is to read the early poetry of an English poet called Wilfred Owen. Wilfred, Wilfred Owen. He was a great poet of the First World War. His poetry of the First World War is great. The poetry he wrote before the First World War, before he'd gone through the agonies of that conflict, is not very good. It's very much watered down Keats, watered down Romanticism. That said, what I like about Raphael's question is the positivity of it. That is to say, I think I was too negative. I think it is entirely right to say that Tolkien in his poetry, although it's not technically very sophisticated, it's derivative or it's traditional, is talking about something really important, and that important thing is fantasy. He never wrote poetry that was not about fantasy. I'm trying to think if that's true. I can't think of a poem that he wrote that is not fantastic, as in being about fantasy. So thank you for those questions. They were really good.
It was really interesting, the question. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it had a lot of pieces to it.
Yeah. Wonderful. So next one was made by me. Okay.
Aha. Can we say that Tolkien's approach to fairy non-fairy stories has some romantic roots, the idea of apprehending reality through imagination instead of simple rationality? Yes, I think that's 100% right. I think it's part of my response is yes, but it's also part of a broader aspect to life, which I find really interesting and which has been commented on by a lot of theorists of Romanticism. And that is, something strange happens in the early 1800s in British literature, and it never goes away. The strange thing that happens is there is a focus on the human emotions and the human imagination that was not there with the neoclassical period. It was not there with Alexander Pope. It was not there with John Dryden. It was not there with William Congreve and so on and so forth. All those neoclassical writers, it was not there with them. They were about reason, the intellect. The Romantics come along, they say, no. What matters is emotion and imagination. Exactly, Cito, what Tolkien's focus is. And that fascination has never gone away. So in 2020, we're still, I think, happily, still rightly, concerned with emotion and imagination. Clearly, science matters. Clearly, the intellect matters. But to us, to humanists, the experience of being alive is so extraordinary that we're not interested in the reality out there. We're interested in our emotional, imaginative response to it. So that's what I would say.
Amazing. I do agree with you. So the last two questions, they are very polemic. Okay.
Good. I like polemic.
Okay, so first one. Okay, I will leave the most polemical one for last. Okay. This one made by Professor Renata Filipov. Professor Renata Filipov is professor of English at Federal University of São Paulo. Okay.
Do you consider fantasy and the fantastic as interchangeable concepts? For rhetorical, I think they're very closely related. They're as related, obviously, as an adjective and a noun might be, right? Of the same root word, fantasy and fantastic. I think they're different in a really important way, rhetorically, or in the construction of arguments. So the word polemic here is good. If I were going to write a book about fantasy, the definition of fantasy, I would do my level best to limit it to just fantasy with particular characteristics and not the fantastic. So, for example, with that one, let's see if I can find it. With Catherine Hume, that's why I moved the slide. With Catherine Hume, Fantasy and Mimesis, she's 100% right that fantasy is an element in all literature, but I would say the fantastic is an element in all literature. I think there is rhetorical value to saying fantasy is that set of works which are created by writers to establish the existence of an entire world, integral, understandable to itself, out there. And the best example always is obviously Tolkien, because of how detailed his world is. But almost any world in a fantasy novel has its own internal rules and its own existence, and is different from the element of fantasy that shows up in literature in general. So my answer is, I don't think they are interchangeable, actually. Although you can make them an argument for it, I wouldn't probably make that argument.
A polemic answer for a polemic question.
I love argument. It's fun.
Wonderful. And the last one, but not least, the most polemical one. This one we've been talking a little in private, okay, last week. Look at that.
This, you did make use of them, right? This is from Monique. Yeah. Love that question, Monique. I also love it because, yeah, it's got an edge to it. In English, we would say, actually, in English, we say it's got side to it. S-I-D-E. We just say it's got side. And that comes from billiards, believe it or not, the game of billiards. But I digress. Yes. I'll tell you my sense of why Tolkien said no to allegory. His stuff is not allegorical. There's two reasons. One is he did not like the idea that somehow the Lord of the Rings was all about the Second World War and Sauron was Hitler or Sauron was Stalin, right? He just says, no, that's dumbing down, making too simple a really rich text, which I agree with him about. But I do think there's allegorical elements in the Lord of the Rings, clearly, and most of his other work. The other reason is maybe a more obscure one. Tolkien, as I've said, was an expert in medieval lit, along with Anglo-Saxon. So he was an expert in plays like Everyman, for example. And Everyman is the quintessential example of an allegory in drama in the medieval period. It is, in my opinion, dreadful from a 21st century point of view dreadful. Because what it does is it has a writer who says that this character represents this virtue, this character represents that vice. And for Tolkien, it's so much richer than that. So he did not want people to think that he was writing something as simple as medieval allegory. The other way to look at this, I think, in terms of allegory, is to say that for him, what interested him is not the allegory that the writer applies to his work, but the allegory that the reader takes away from it. So, Monique, you could say as a reader, I can take pieces of the Lord of the Rings and I can map it onto my own life allegorically, or I can map it onto the current political situation, and it's useful to me. And Tolkien says, that's great, but I'm not about to limit the meaning of the text by doing that for you. Now, C.S. Lewis, loved that connection to C.S. Lewis. As you know, I'm sure, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien had a difficult friendship. And at the end of their lives, it was not the close friendship that had been when they were younger men. And I think one of the reasons Tolkien quarreled with Lewis for two principal reasons. One is they believed in a different Protestantism. And this I find hard to believe because I'm a Buddhist. Actually, my philosophy is Buddhism, so I find this hard to get my head around. But I was brought up Anglican, so I kind of understand it. Tolkien was a Catholic. C.S. Lewis was an evangelical Protestant. They are very, very different things. The other reason that they fell out of friendship is that, and this is not to disrespect C.S. Lewis's achievement, the Chronicles of Narnia are highly allegorical, deliberately highly allegorical. Aslan in Narnia means something very definite, and actually C.S. Lewis is on record as saying what that means. And so Tolkien felt that C.S. Lewis was not subtle in the way that he was subtle as a writer. There's another reason too, finally, and this is me editorializing. I think Tolkien was jealous of the amount that Lewis finished. Lewis finished 7 Chronicles of Narnia before Tolkien spent 17 years writing The Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien was all about process and Lewis was about product, and that's not going to increase a friendship, I think. So that was a great question. Thank you, Moni. We really liked it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Toby. It was fantastic. That was the last one question, okay, we had. And we have many messages for you here in the comments on YouTube. I'd like to show you, because they express, care about your talking. We have here João Vitor talking about your poem on Galadriel. Beautiful poem. We have also here Emanuele, that poem, just wonderful. And what else? We have here Gilmar, who made one of the questions, okay, saying that your answer was amazing. We have here Rafael, that you also answered one of his questions, telling you that your answer was incredible. We have here Professor Claudia Negro telling you that she wants to read your book, the book you are preparing, okay, that you mentioned. Yes. And here, the last one is Professor Renata thanking you, okay. So, Toby, it was fantastic. It was amazing. Thank you so much. It was.
Could I just say something, Cito? And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but could I say something about Galadriel?
Yes, for sure.
Why do I love Galadriel so much? So Galadriel is tempted to take the ring, and she doesn't. She understands the limits of power, and I think that's an incredibly important moment. But what I actually love her for is if you read the Silmarillion, you will see that she makes a huge error in her life in the First Age. And she lives with that error for the rest of her life before she goes back west at the very end. And she lives with it, and I deeply admire somebody who in life can make a mistake and learn from it and live with it. I just love her for that. She's an incredibly inspiring character, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What a wonderful time.
Galadriel is one of my favorite characters, one of the characters in my heart in the Lord of the Rings. She's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, Toby, with all people saying thank you to you here, everybody saying thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Toby.
It's a great pleasure.
It was a great pleasure to have you here, and people loved it. We had many questions. We had up for 50 people, following the live on YouTube. Okay, nice. Along the entire talking. It was fantastic. It was amazing. Okay, like a whole field auditorium listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So I will say thank you to everyone, okay, here in Portuguese, and tell them about the next time that we will have in our event program. And then
okay.
I'm sorry?
Shall I stay or shall I leave?
Yeah, please. Okay. I'd like you to stay here in the room.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And then I will finish the transmission. Okay. I'd like to remain on the room so we can talk a bit privately. Okay.
Okay.
So, então, pessoal, é isso. Essa foi a nossa conferência de abertura. Muito obrigado pela participação de todos, muito obrigado pelas perguntas que foram colocadas. O professor Toby ficou muito feliz de participar aqui com a gente, ele estava me dizendo isso agora. Ele está muito grato, ficou muito feliz de participar conosco. E muito obrigado pela presença de vocês, foi fantástico as perguntas. E agora, então, nós temos, dando continuidade à nossa programação, nós temos um intervalo, então, aqui no nosso evento, até às 16h30, tá? E depois, às 16h30, às 18h30, nós temos os primeiros simpósios do evento. Os simpósios vão ser pelo Google Meet, então, tem uma olhadinha na página do Facebook do evento, tá? Quem quiser continuar a prestigiar, quem quiser dar uma olhada nos simpósios, os links das salas do Meet estão lá no Facebook, tá bem? E depois, às 18h30, nós voltamos aqui com uma nova live, a primeira mesa redonda que nós vamos ter aqui no evento, a mesa redonda Escrever Literatura Fantástica, que nós vamos ter 2 escritores de literatura fantástica aqui conversando com a gente, que é o Enéas Tavares e a Nikellen Vitter. E a moderação vai ser do nosso querido Alexander Meirelles da Silva, do canal Fantástico Cursos, e nosso colega aqui do grupo também. Então, a gente espera todos vocês aqui de novo no canal do Vertentes do Fantástico na Literatura, às 18h30, depois dos simpósios, tá bem? Um abraço para todos, obrigado e até mais tarde.